My name is Jack Richardson, and what I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you think you know about the coming weeks ahead of us. I am a 38-year-old business executive, someone who has always lived by spreadsheets, profit margins, and quarterly reports. My world revolved around concrete facts and measurable outcomes. I had no time for anything that couldn't be quantified or analyzed in a boardroom presentation. Faith was something other people had, something I respected from a distance, but never allowed to interfere with my carefully constructed life of success and achievement. That Tuesday morning began like any other day in my meticulously planned existence. I was driving to the most important meeting of my career, a merger discussion that would either make my company a major player in the tech industry or leave us struggling to survive in an increasingly competitive market. I remember checking my watch as I navigated through the downtown traffic, calculating exactly how much time I had before the presentation that would determine our future. The rain had started falling heavily during the night and continued into the morning, turning the familiar streets into treacherous waterways that reflected the gray November sky above. I was reviewing my talking points one final time at a red light when I noticed the delivery truck in my peripheral vision. The driver was clearly struggling to maintain control on the slick pavement as he approached the intersection from my right. Time seemed to slow down as I watched him pump his brakes frantically, the massive vehicle sliding sideways through the red light directly toward my driver's side door. There was no time to react, no time to pray, no time to think about anything except the crushing inevitability of what was about to happen. The impact was devastating and instantaneous. One moment I was gripping my steering wheel and thinking about market projections, and the next I felt myself rising above the twisted wreckage that had been my luxury sedan just seconds before. The sensation of leaving my physical body was unlike anything I could have ever imagined. It wasn't painful or frightening, but rather like stepping out of clothes that had suddenly become too tight. I could see my own body trapped inside the mangled metal below, blood streaming from wounds I couldn't feel, completely motionless while paramedics rushed toward the scene with equipment I knew wouldn't be enough. As I hovered above the accident site, watching the frantic efforts to extract what remained of my physical form, a brilliant light began to appear in the distance. This wasn't the harsh glare of emergency vehicles or the cold illumination of hospital lights. This was something alive, something that pulsed with warmth and recognition and an overwhelming sense of coming home. The light grew larger and more intense as it approached, but instead of hurting my spiritual eyes, it filled me with a peace I had never experienced during my years of chasing success and accumulating wealth. Within that radiant glow, I began to make out a figure walking toward me with purposeful strides. Even before I could see his face clearly, my soul recognized who was approaching. This was Jesus Christ, the same Jesus I had heard about in childhood Sunday school classes, but had long since relegated to the category of nice stories that had no place in the real world of business and competition. His presence was unmistakable, carrying an authority that made every cell of my spiritual being respond with reverence and awe. His appearance was both exactly what I expected and completely surprising at the same time. He looked like a man in his 30s, but his eyes held the wisdom of eternity itself. When he smiled at me, I felt every barrier I had ever built around my heart crumble into dust. The love radiating from him was more powerful than any emotion I had ever experienced, more real than any success I had ever achieved, more satisfying than any deal I had ever closed. "Jack," he said, and hearing my name spoken by the voice that had called the universe into existence made me understand for the first time what worship truly meant. "You have been brought here because there are things my people must see before the year comes to its end. The time between December 20th and December 24th will mark a turning point that most are not prepared for. I have chosen you to witness what is coming, so you can warn those who still have ears to hear. I wanted to ask why he had chosen someone like me, someone who had spent most of his adult life ignoring spiritual matters in favor of material pursuits. But somehow I understood that this wasn't the time for questions. This was the time to listen, to observe, to receive whatever revelation he needed to share with a world that was running out of time to prepare for what was approaching. The space around us began to shift and change, reality itself bending to accommodate the visions he was about to show me. I felt his hand on my shoulder, not physical touch, but something far more substantial than anything physical could ever be. What you are about to witness will be difficult to understand with your earthly mind, he explained, his voice carrying both infinite compassion and urgent warning. But you must remember every detail, every word, every image I show you. The people need to know what is coming in those final days of December. Suddenly, we were no longer in that place of brilliant light, but standing somewhere that felt both familiar and completely foreign. I realized we were looking down at Earth, but not the Earth I knew from satellite images or geography textbooks. This was Earth as seen from a spiritual perspective, where I could perceive not just the physical landscape, but the spiritual condition of every nation, every city, every human heart beating within the boundaries of this troubled planet. The first thing that struck me was how different everything looked when viewed through spiritual eyes. Cities that appeared prosperous and thriving in the natural realm were shrouded in darkness when seen from this eternal perspective. Nations that seemed powerful and influential were actually weak and crumbling under the weight of their spiritual poverty. But scattered throughout this darkness were points of brilliant light. Individuals and communities whose hearts were aligned with heaven's purposes, shining like stars in the spiritual night that had settled over so much of humanity. Look carefully at what I am about to show you, Jesus said, his voice filled with both love and profound sadness. The days between December 20th and December 24th, 2025 will witness events that will shake the foundations of everything people think they understand about their world. Many will call these events coincidences or natural disasters, but those with spiritual discernment will recognize them as signs that the season of grace is drawing to its appointed end. The vision began to unfold before me like a movie playing on the screen of eternity itself. I saw December 20th dawning across different time zones, appearing normal and peaceful to most observers. People were going about their usual routines, finishing last-minute Christmas shopping, preparing for holiday gatherings, completely unaware that this day would mark the beginning of the most significant period in recent human history. The first sign came from the heavens themselves. I watched as unusual atmospheric phenomena began appearing in skies around the world. These weren't typical weather patterns or ordinary celestial events. They were displays of light and color that defied scientific explanation, visible reminders that the natural laws governing our universe were responding to spiritual realities most people couldn't perceive. Scientists would scramble to provide rational explanations, but those with eyes to see would recognize these signs as fulfillment of ancient prophecies about the last days. But the heavenly signs were only the beginning. Jesus showed me how the spiritual atmosphere of Earth itself would shift dramatically during these 4 crucial days. Barriers between the physical and spiritual realms would become thinner than they had been in centuries, allowing for supernatural encounters and divine interventions that would leave witnesses forever changed. Some would experience visions and dreams of unprecedented clarity. Others would hear the voice of God speaking directly to their hearts with instructions for the challenging times ahead. I watched as prayer meetings around the world suddenly became charged with an electricity that hadn't been present just days before. Believers who had been going through the motions of religious routine found themselves encountering the living God in ways they had only read about in Scripture. Healings that medical science couldn't explain began occurring in unprecedented numbers. Hearts that had been hardened by years of disappointment and cynicism were suddenly open to receive divine love. Families that had been torn apart by conflict and misunderstanding were supernaturally reconciled. Yet not everyone would respond positively to these manifestations of divine power. Jesus showed me how the same spiritual intensity that brought breakthrough and blessings to some would trigger fear and rebellion in others. Those who had built their lives on rejecting God's authority would find themselves increasingly uncomfortable as His presence became more tangible. In their daily experience, the contrast between light and darkness would become more pronounced, forcing people to choose sides in ways they had been able to avoid before. The vision continued to unfold, showing me specific events that would occur on December 21st. I saw financial markets around the world experiencing unprecedented volatility as investors struggled to understand the meaning of the signs they were witnessing. But this wasn't the typical market instability caused by economic factors or political uncertainty. This was the beginning of a fundamental shift in how value itself would be measured in the days to come. Jesus showed me how people's priorities would begin changing during these 4 days in ways that would shock even their closest family members. Individuals who had spent their entire lives accumulating wealth and possessions would suddenly find themselves compelled to give generously to those in need. Business leaders would make decisions based on spiritual principles rather than profit margins. Politicians would begin speaking truth instead of carefully crafted messages designed to maintain their power. The transformation wasn't limited to individual hearts. I witnessed entire communities being swept up in waves of repentance and renewal. Churches that had been struggling with declining attendance and spiritual apathy suddenly found themselves filled beyond capacity with people hungry for authentic encounters with God. Denominational barriers that had divided believers for centuries began crumbling as people recognized their common need for divine intervention in an increasingly chaotic world. But what I witnessed on December 22nd left me completely unprepared for the magnitude of what was unfolding. Jesus showed me how the spiritual awakening that had begun would suddenly accelerate beyond anything the modern world had ever experienced. I watched as entire nations that had been hostile to Christianity for decades found their hearts inexplicably softened toward the gospel message. Government leaders who had spent years persecuting believers were suddenly overcome with conviction about their actions and began publicly apologizing for their treatment of God's people. The most remarkable aspect of this transformation was how it transcended cultural and religious boundaries that had seemed impossible to bridge. I saw Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, and people of every faith background finding themselves drawn to Jesus in ways they couldn't explain or resist. It wasn't through human persuasion or clever arguments, but through direct divine revelation that penetrated hearts that had been closed to spiritual truth for years or even decades. In the vision, I witnessed mass baptisms taking place in rivers, lakes, and oceans around the world as millions of people responded to the call of salvation. The scenes were breathtaking and overwhelming. Families that had been divided by religious differences were suddenly united in their newfound faith. Children were leading their parents to Christ. Elderly people who had spent their entire lives rejecting God were weeping as they experienced His love for the first time. But Jesus also showed me the darker response that would emerge during these same days. I saw how those in positions of worldly power would become increasingly desperate to maintain control as they watched their influence crumble in the face of this spiritual revolution. Media outlets would work overtime to discredit the testimonies of those who had experienced supernatural encounters. Scientists would propose increasingly elaborate theories to explain away the miraculous events that were occurring with undeniable frequency. The resistance wasn't limited to secular authorities. Jesus revealed to me how certain religious leaders who had built their careers on maintaining traditional power structures would actually oppose the move of God's Spirit because it threatened their institutional control. They would label the supernatural manifestations as deception or emotional manipulation, warning their congregations to be suspicious of any spiritual experience that didn't come through approved channels. This broke my heart more than anything else I witnessed, to see people who claimed to serve God actively working against His purposes simply because those purposes didn't align with their expectations or their desire for control was devastating. Jesus noticed my emotional response and spoke words that burned themselves into my memory forever. Many will stumble because they have made their religion about themselves rather than about me. He said with infinite sadness, they have forgotten that my ways are higher than their ways and my thoughts higher than their thoughts. When I move in power, it will offend their pride and challenge their assumptions about how I should work in the world. The vision then shifted to show me December 23rd, and what I saw that day filled me with both tremendous hope and profound urgency. Jesus revealed how the spiritual momentum that had been building would reach a crescendo that would affect every person on earth in some measurable way. No one would be able to claim they hadn't been given an opportunity to respond to God's calling during this critical period. I watched as divine dreams and visions became so common that even the most skeptical individuals couldn't dismiss them as coincidence or imagination. People who had never opened a Bible found themselves quoting scripture they had never read. Hardened criminals were suddenly overwhelmed with remorse for their actions and began confessing crimes they had committed years earlier. Corrupt politicians were compelled to admit their dishonesty and make restitution to those they had wronged. The supernatural wasn't limited to internal transformation. Jesus showed me physical healings occurring on a scale that would overwhelm medical facilities around the world. Blind eyes were opened, deaf ears were unstopped, paralyzed limbs were restored, and terminal diseases disappeared instantly without any medical intervention. Hospital workers who witnessed these miracles would become some of the most powerful evangelists, sharing their testimonies with anyone who would listen. But perhaps the most significant aspect of December 23rd was how it would serve as a final invitation for those who had been resisting God's call. Jesus showed me how His mercy would be extended in unprecedented ways during this day, with divine encounters specifically designed to reach the hearts of those who had seemed hopelessly hardened against spiritual truth. I saw drug dealers having visions of Jesus while in the middle of their transactions, dropping their illegal substances and weeping as they experienced forgiveness they never believed was possible. I witnessed corrupt business leaders suddenly unable to continue their unethical practices as their consciences were awakened by supernatural conviction. Even hardened atheists found themselves face to face with the reality of God's existence in ways they could no longer deny or explain away. Yet Jesus also revealed the sobering truth that not everyone would respond positively to these final opportunities. Some would witness undeniable miracles and still choose to harden their hearts further. Others would experience direct divine encounters and dismiss them as hallucinations or mental breakdowns rather than admit the need for salvation. The most heartbreaking aspect of the vision was seeing how pride would prevent many people from accepting the very help they desperately needed. Jesus showed me individuals who would rather maintain their intellectual sophistication or their reputation for skepticism than humble themselves enough to receive the gift of eternal life that was being offered so freely. Then vision moved to December 24th, and what Jesus revealed about this final day left me trembling with a mixture of awe and terror. This would be the day when the window of extraordinary grace would begin to close, when the spiritual atmosphere that had made such dramatic transformations possible would start to shift towards something entirely different. I watched as those who had responded to God's call during the previous 4 days found themselves filled with an inexplicable peace and joy that transcended their circumstances. Even believers who faced persecution or hardship because of their newfound faith carried within themselves a supernatural strength that enabled them to endure anything with grace and hope. But those who had consistently rejected the divine invitations extended to them during these crucial days would find themselves experiencing a different kind of transformation. It wasn't that God was punishing them, but rather that they were reaping inevitable consequences of their persistent rejection of His love and mercy. Jesus showed me how spiritual sensitivity would begin to diminish among those who had hardened their hearts. Their ability to perceive divine truth would gradually fade until they found themselves unable to recognize God's voice, even when He was speaking directly to them. This wasn't a cruel judgment, but the natural result of repeatedly choosing darkness over light. The vision revealed how families would be divided during this time, not by God's design, but by the choices individuals made in response to His calling. I saw households where some members had embraced the spiritual awakening, while others had rejected it, creating tensions and conflicts that would persist long after December 24th had passed. Most sobering of all was Jesus' revelation about what would happen to the church during and after these 4 pivotal days. He showed me how congregations would be permanently divided between those who had welcomed the move of His Spirit and those who had opposed it out of fear or institutional loyalty. Many of my people have forgotten that I am the God who does new things. He said with deep sadness, they have become so comfortable with their traditions and their predictable routines that they will resist my power when it doesn't conform to their expectations. They will choose the safety of their familiar religion over the adventure of genuine relationship with me. The vision continued to unfold, showing me the long-term consequences of these December days. I saw how the choices people made during this brief window would determine not only their eternal destiny, but also their effectiveness in the challenging times that would follow. Those who had positioned themselves to receive God's grace and power would become lights in an increasingly dark world, while those who had rejected His calling would find themselves spiritually impotent when they needed divine help. Most, as the vision began to fade, Jesus turned to me with eyes that held both infinite love and urgent concern. "Jack," He said, using my name in a way that made my spirit burn within me, "you have seen what is coming in just 42 days. The time for preparation is now while hearts are still able to respond to my voice. Tell them that December 20th through 24th will be their final invitation to choose life over death, light over darkness, eternity with me over eternity without me." The weight of this responsibility settled on my shoulders like a crushing burden. How could I, someone who had spent most of his life focused on profit margins and business strategies, carry a message of such eternal significance? But Jesus seemed to understand my concern and spoke words that strengthened my resolve even as they increased my sense of urgency. To my sense of urgency, "You are not chosen because of your qualifications," He continued, His voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I choose the weak things of the world to confound the mighty, the foolish things to shame the wise." Your business background, your analytical mind, your understanding of how systems work and fail, these are the very tools I need to reach hearts that have been hardened by material success and worldly wisdom. I felt His hand upon my spiritual forehead, and suddenly my mind was flooded with clarity about what I had witnessed and what it meant for the world. The December days I had seen weren't isolated events, but part of a larger divine plan that had been unfolding for generations. Every prayer uttered by faithful believers, every tear shed over lost loved ones, every act of sacrificial love had been building toward this moment when heaven would break through into human history in undeniable ways. But Jesus wasn't finished showing me what lay ahead. As the visions of December began to fade, new images began forming in the spiritual atmosphere around us. I found myself looking at the months that would follow those crucial 4 days, and what I saw filled me with both wonder and deep concern. January 2026 appeared before me like a landscape transformed by fire. Spiritual awakening that had begun in December would continue to spread, but not without fierce opposition. I watched as governments around the world would struggle to maintain control over populations that had been radically transformed by divine encounter. Laws that had been designed to restrict religious expression would suddenly seem powerless against the supernatural boldness of believers who had tasted heaven's reality. The economic systems I had spent my career mastering would begin to crumble as people's values underwent fundamental shifts. I saw stock markets fluctuating wildly as investors tried to understand a world where profit was no longer the primary motivator for human behavior. Companies built on exploitation and deception would find themselves unable to operate as their workforces experienced moral awakenings that made unethical business practices impossible to continue. But perhaps most shocking was what Jesus revealed about the religious establishment during this period. Many denominations that had existed for centuries would split completely as the supernatural manifestations of God's power challenged their theological frameworks. Traditional church leaders would find themselves powerless to control congregations that had experienced direct encounters with the living Christ. I have always moved outside the boundaries that human institutions try to place around me, Jesus explained as these visions unfolded. What you will witness in the coming months will separate those who truly know me from those who merely know about Many will discover that their religion has been built on human tradition rather than divine relationship. The vision shifted to show me specific regions of the world and how they would be affected by the spiritual transformation. Beginning in December, I saw areas that had been closed to Christian influence for decades, suddenly opening as government officials experienced supernatural encounters that changed their perspectives overnight. Persecution that had seemed permanent would begin to lift as those in authority found themselves unable to continue oppressing believers after witnessing undeniable displays of divine power. But the opposition wouldn't disappear entirely. Jesus showed me how it would evolve and intensify in different ways. Those who rejected the move of his Spirit would become increasingly desperate to discredit the testimonies and miracles that could no longer be hidden from public view. Media campaigns would be launched to convince people that supernatural events were mass hysteria or carefully orchestrated hoaxes. I watched as supposed experts would appear on television programs offering psychological explanations for the transformations occurring in millions of lives simultaneously. Scientific studies would be commissioned to prove that the healings and miracles were either fraudulent or could be explained through natural phenomena. The same intellectual pride that had always resisted divine truth would marshal all its resources to maintain its grip on human understanding. Yet even these efforts would ultimately fail because the evidence would be too overwhelming and too personal for people to dismiss. Jesus revealed how the supernatural encounters during those December days would be so individually specific and profoundly life-changing that no amount of expert testimony could convince those who experienced them that they had been deceived. The vision then moved forward to show me February and March of 2026. And what I witnessed during these months left me struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the transformation that would sweep across human civilization. Educational institutions that had spent decades promoting secular worldviews would find themselves unable to maintain their influence over students who had experienced divine revelation firsthand. I saw university professors abandoning their carefully constructed arguments against the existence of God after witnessing healings and miracles in their own classrooms. Students who had been indoctrinated with materialistic philosophies would suddenly find themselves overwhelmed with hunger for spiritual truth that their academic training could never satisfy. The entertainment industry would undergo revolutionary changes as performers and creators who had built their careers on promoting moral relativism found themselves convicted about the content they had been producing. Movies and music that had celebrated rebellion against divine authority would suddenly seem empty and meaningless to audiences who had tasted the reality of God's love. But Jesus also showed me the resistance that would emerge from those whose power and influence depended on maintaining the status quo. I watched as powerful individuals would form alliances specifically designed to undermine the credibility of the spiritual awakening. Vast sums of money would be spent on propaganda campaigns intended to convince the public that the supernatural events were either mass delusion or elaborate deception. These efforts would succeed in hardening the hearts of some, but they would ultimately fail to stop the momentum of divine transformation, because God's power would continue to manifest in ways that transcended human ability to explain or control. The very attempts to discredit the miracles would often result in those making the accusations experiencing supernatural encounters themselves. The vision continued into the spring months of 2026, revealing how the spiritual transformation would begin affecting international relations and global politics. I saw world leaders who had built their careers on power and manipulation suddenly finding themselves unable to continue their deceptive practices after experiencing divine conviction about their actions. Treaties that had seemed impossible to negotiate would be signed as former enemies discovered common ground in their shared recognition of divine authority. Wars that had raged for decades would begin to wind down as military leaders found themselves unwilling to continue violence after witnessing the supernatural peace that characterized those who had been transformed by the December encounters. But not every nation would respond positively to these changes. Jesus showed me how some governments would become increasingly authoritarian in their attempts to suppress the spiritual movement that threatened their control over their populations. Laws would be passed specifically targeting believers who testified about their supernatural experiences, and technology would be deployed to monitor and restrict religious activities. Yet even these oppressive measures would ultimately backfire, as the persecution would only strengthen the faith of those who had genuinely encountered God's power. I watched as believers who faced imprisonment or worse for their testimonies would experience such supernatural joy and peace that their very presence in prisons and detention centers would begin converting their guards and fellow inmates. The vision then revealed something that shook me to my very core. Jesus showed me how the spiritual awakening that began in December would eventually force every person on earth to make a definitive choice about their eternal destiny. The supernatural manifestations would become so frequent and undeniable that neutrality would no longer be possible. I saw how this would divide families, communities, and nations in ways that had never occurred in human history. Parents would find themselves estranged from children who chose to reject the divine encounters they had witnessed. Marriages would end as spouses made opposite decisions about how to respond to God's calling. Lifelong friendships would be severed as the spiritual transformation revealed fundamental differences in people's hearts that had previously been hidden. This is the time of separation I spoke of in my earthly ministry, Jesus explained as these painful scenes unfolded before me. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword to divide households and reveal the true condition of every heart. What you are witnessing is not my desire, but the inevitable result of human choice when confronted with divine truth. The most heartbreaking aspect of this vision was seeing how some people would witness undeniable miracles and still choose to harden their hearts rather than submit to God's authority. Pride, fear, and attachment to sinful lifestyles would prove stronger than the evidence of divine power they observed with their own eyes. But for every heart that chose rejection, Jesus showed me many more that would choose acceptance and transformation. The harvest of souls during this period would exceed anything recorded in church history, with entire people groups coming to faith simultaneously as God's Spirit moved across geographical and cultural boundaries that had seemed impermeable. As the vision moved into the summer months of 2026, I saw how the supernatural transformation would begin affecting the very fabric of human society. Legal systems that had been built on humanistic principles would struggle to function as judges and attorneys experienced moral awakenings that made corruption and injustice impossible to tolerate. I watched as court cases that had been dragging on for years would suddenly be resolved as both plaintiffs and defendants found themselves compelled to seek truth and reconciliation rather than victory at any cost. Prisons would become centers of spiritual transformation as inmates experienced divine encounters that led to genuine repentance and rehabilitation. The healthcare system would undergo revolutionary changes as medical professionals witnessed healings that defied every principle of modern medicine. Hospitals that had functioned purely as business enterprises would rediscover their calling to serve human need with compassion and excellence. But perhaps most significant was what Jesus revealed about the transformation of human relationships during this period. I saw marriages that had been on the brink of divorce being supernaturally restored as couples experienced divine love that enabled them to forgive and rebuild trust. Children who had been rebellious and destructive would suddenly become respectful and responsible as their hearts were touched by God's transforming power. Communities that had been divided by racial, economic, and cultural tensions would find unity as people recognized their common need for divine grace and their shared identity as God's beloved creation. Superficial differences that had seemed so important would fade in significance as people experienced the reality of spiritual brotherhood that transcended all human categories. Then suddenly, I felt that familiar pulling sensation, the overwhelming sense of being drawn back towards something I couldn't see. The beautiful visions began to fade, and Jesus' presence started to recede, though his final words echoed through every fiber of my spiritual being. Go now, Jack, and tell them what you have seen. The time between December 20th and 24th will determine the eternal destiny of millions. Those who have ears to hear will recognize the truth in your testimony. Do not be discouraged by those who reject your words, for I myself was rejected by many. Plant the seeds faithfully and trust me to bring the harvest. The brilliant light that had surrounded us began to dim, and I felt myself falling through dimensions I couldn't comprehend, pulled by an irresistible force back toward my physical form. The transition was jarring and painful, like being forced into clothes that no longer fit properly after experiencing the freedom of pure spiritual existence. I gasped violently at life returned to my body, my lungs burning as they filled with air for the first time in what felt like hours, but had been only minutes in earthly time. Every detail of the vision remained crystal clear in my mind, burned there by divine fire that no amount of time or skepticism could ever extinguish. As I lay there struggling to adjust to physical sensation again, I understood with absolute certainty that I had been given the most important assignment of my life. The visions weren't just for me, but for everyone who would listen, everyone who still had time to prepare their hearts for what's coming in just 42 days. December 20th through 24th, 2025 will mark humanity's final invitation before everything changes forever. The choice each person makes during those 4 crucial days will echo throughout eternity. I pray that those who hear this testimony will not dismiss it, but will examine their own hearts and prepare for the greatest spiritual awakening our world has ever witnessed. Thank you for journeying with us all the way to this final moment. If you're still here, then something has spoken to your heart in a way that cannot be ignored. We invite you now to respond in a simple, meaningful way. Write a comment letting us know the nation or city you are watching from so we can lift your land and your people in our prayers. If you haven't yet, take a moment to subscribe and activate the notification bell so that none of the messages, testimonies, and revelations meant for you are ever missed. And we ask one last act of love. Share this video with at least 3 people in your life, someone dear to you, someone struggling, someone searching. You never know how deeply one message can touch a soul, restore faith, or awaken someone who has fallen into silence. May the Lord surround you with His light, strengthen your spirit, and guide your steps in peace.